Okay, Ling 201, welcome back to the lecture series. Today we're going to move on and talk about lexical semantics. And so I want to say that before we do this, there is a quick write for this lecture. It's a word association quick write, and normally we do it in class, and you read aloud a pair of words to a partner, and then after you read aloud those words, they say the first word they can think of, and you write it down. And normally I only give out one sheet per person for this, and there's kind of different structures of these word pairs as you go through it. If you want to do this quick write, you only have to do one of these pages. If you want to do all four, you can go ahead and do all four. Maybe you'll see what the differences are there. And then usually I compile the sort of responses people give and then talk about them a little bit in the last lecture for the class, which is going to happen after this lecture. But either way, give this a try before you watch this lecture, because there's going to be yet one more quick write before the very last lecture for the class, which is going to be the next one I'll post about sort of semantic differences between languages and also language death a little bit. But for now, we're just going to talk about lexical semantics, which I've kind of promised in previous lectures about pragmatics and semantics. I've got this little cartoon here from a previous student's quick write, which you can enjoy kind of in your spare time as we go, but that'll lead us into what we're going to do for today. Okay, so we talked about this before, but we've got pragmatics, which is how linguistic expressions get their meaning from conversation, context, and discourse. Then there's compositional semantics, which is how you can build up the meaning of phrases and sentences from the meanings of the individual words in those phrases and sentences. But we haven't talked yet about the meaning of individual words themselves and how they're related to one another. So that's what we're going to focus on for today. And a lot of this, or some of this, might be familiar to you to begin with. So we'll start off with sort of the basic relationships we can get in meaning between different words. So one relationship that you've probably heard of at some point is synonymy, or you can talk about synonyms. So these are two words that have the same meaning, more or less. Sometimes you can have closer synonymic relationships than others. These are basically exact matches, so couch and sofa, groundhog and woodchuck, hide and conceal. They mean the exact same thing. So you can think about this in terms of our sort of mechanic for determining what the meaning of expressions is by saying that, well, the real world extensions of these terms are identical. The things they pick out in the world are the exact same things. And I'll say here before I move on too quickly, for me, couch and sofa mean pretty much exactly the same thing. Before I moved to Canada, which was 13 years ago now, I had always heard that there was a Canadian term for these things, which is Chesterfield. But I don't meet that many Canadians who admit to using that word, or maybe even some don't even know what it means. But maybe you can slot Chesterfield in here too, if you're that sort of Canadian. A similar relationship, but not obviously the same thing, is hyponymy. And maybe you haven't heard of this one before. This is where you have one word's extension being a subset of another word's extension. So you can think about this like a dog. Everybody knows what a dog is, and hopefully you all know what a poodle is, but a poodle is a type of dog. So that's a hyponym of dog. Basically, they have a hyponymous relationship. A laptop is a type of computer. Just carrying on from the planets discussion last time, there's a type of planet called a gas giant, like Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, the big ones out in the furthest reaches of the solar system. Those are a type of planet, so they have a hyponymous relationship here too. And then this is kind of relating it back to those primitive diagrams I showed you last time, but say a canine and a dog, those are both synonyms here, at least in this world. So all these things have this, are the same predicate for a dog, and a canine applies to the same set of reference in the world. And then you can also think of hyponym, again, as just a subset relationship. So let's say that Fifi and Tinkerbell are poodles, but they're also dogs, but we have other dogs that are not poodles. This is just a subset of the whole set of dogs. Okay, and then you have heard of antonyms before, I'm pretty sure, and that's generally speaking what we think of when words mean the opposite of each other rather than the same thing as each other. The textbook walks you through different types of antonyms though, so I'll walk through those for you to hear too. So they've got complementary antonyms, where everything in the world is one thing or the other. So at least in the world of people, you have married people and unmarried people. There's no kind of ambiguity between that. Things can be either present or absent. Things are either visible or invisible, and there's a dividing line which separates two different sets of things in the world between those two terms, right? Those are complementary, kind of like things, sort of allophones being in complementary distribution back in our phonology days, right? You either find one in a particular context or you don't. Relational antonyms are where there's a sort of connection between the two terms that's symmetrical, but you can't be both, right? So give and receive, I can give you something, and if I give it to you, you receive it from me. Same thing for like buy or sell. I'm your teacher, you're my student, or pupil is a kind of old-fashioned term for that. So we're on opposite ends of a relationship here. These words form relational antonyms. There's also kind of a nice morphological way to express this in English, which people kind of extend sometimes to new uses for humorous terms or humorous purposes, but like an employer and an employee, an employer, employee, advisor, advisee, and an employer employs somebody who's their employee, so on and so forth, right? These are the affixes at the end, and e, which signify that relationship. Scalar antonyms are where words form two ends of a scale, so like hot and cold, or happy and sad, big and small. Hot and cold is kind of an easy one to think about because we have ways of quantifying how hot or cold something is, right? And there's a scale, that's where the word scalar comes from. There's a scale we can use to determine exactly how hot or cold something is. And maybe you think like, well, 30 degrees Celsius outside is really hot, and maybe -10 is really cold. I don't know exactly where the dividing line between that is for you. 10, 15, 20, I don't know. It probably depends on who you are as a person and where you come from. But there's no strict dividing line between hot and cold in the same way there is for like unmarried and married, right? Where there's a clear gap between the two terms. So this is what we get for scalar antonyms. They're not quite the same thing as complementary antonyms, although there's still kind of two ends or two opposites there. There's also homonyms, or what we sometimes call homophones. They're words with the same pronunciation, but they have unrelated meanings. This comes again from an ancient Greek root. Homo means same here, and onuma means name, so basically the same name for two different things. The word trunk encompasses three different homophones that I can think of, at least off the top of my head or off the top of the slide. So the trunk of an elephant, the long nose, the trunk, which is a chest, or maybe the trunk of a tree. These mean totally different things, right? But we use the same string of phonemes to express those different concepts. And these words don't have to be spelled the same way either. So the words bear and bear, this is the animal that lives out in the forest. This is when something is unclothed, and they mean totally different things, although normally bears are naked by bear standards. But they're spelled a different way, but they're pronounced the same way, right? So these are homophones or homonyms as well. These can create ambiguity, which is kind of fun. So if I say we saw her duck, that can mean two different things, right? We saw, like, maybe some woman out there owns a waterfowl, and we saw that waterfowl. We saw her duck at some point in time. Or else the duck can be like a verb. You can duck to sort of avoid something hitting your head, so maybe we saw her do that as well. Different kinds of ambiguity here that homophones lead us to. It's like when we get ambiguity at this sort of lexical level, that's simply what it's called, lexical ambiguity, that these individual words can mean different things, rather than, say, structural ambiguity, where we're getting different syntactic structures for an entire phrase or sentence that lead to different interpretations, like we saw in the syntax homework that was due today. Okay, a related notion is polysemy, which is when one word has several different but related meanings. So this also comes from Greek. So poly means many in Greek, and sema means signal. This is different signals from one superficially similar word. So you can talk about like the mouth of an animal, and that's something similar to the mouth of a river, which is where the river deposits its water flow in some greater body of water, right? It empties it out. So if you think of like the flow of air coming out of your mouth, there's something similar there between the mouth of an animal in the mouth of a river. A baseball diamond looks like a geometric diamond, and that also looks like the way a diamond stone is normally cut. So all these things are kind of related, but they're not exactly the same meaning, right? So that's polysemy. Moving on a bit, we've discussed how in compositional semantics we talked about how the reference of nouns and the extensions of predicates can get put together to form a meaningful proposition, and how it can sort of use that formalism to evaluate the truth values of particular propositions. We can do something sort of similar. We can use a similar sort of framework to figure out how adjectives and nouns work together in noun phrases. And the simplest case for how this works is what's called pure intersection. These are going to look like similar concepts from math or logic if you've encountered them before. But say you have the expression black dogs. That you can think of as a set of all dogs in the world intersected with the set of all black things. And I'll lay that out for you here in another one of these simple boxes and arrows diagrams. But let's say we have a group of dogs in our world, like Marmaduke, Odie, Lassie, Spud, Spot, and Rex. And then we have a bunch of black things in the world, including oil and charcoal and Darth Vader. But there's two things which are both in the set of black things and in the set of dogs, and those are black dogs, Spot, and Rex, who aren't particularly famous, but let's just take my word for it. They're black dogs. So the crucial thing here is they have to be both members of both predicates, as it were. I borrowed this example of a similar sort of situation from the internet a few years ago, trying to define what exactly makes up a geek, nerd, and a dork. I don't know if you think this is, dweeb too, if this works, but these are three different features: intelligence, social ineptitude, and obsession, which may define all four of these terms together. Maybe you think that works. Maybe you think that's slightly humorous. I don't know, but my guess is that if you really are into linguistics, you're probably somewhere in the middle of this Venn diagram somewhere. Anyways, one idea that semanticists have attempted to use to analyze the structure of lexical meanings is that the meaning of a word can be precisely determined by the pure intersection of predicates of which it is a hyponym, a subset. So that's a lot of verbiage there, but it's kind of like trying to define a set of features of meaning in the same way that we had distinctive features in phonology, right? Ideally, a universal set of meaning features that we can try to find in any word that's used in any particular language. And this works really well for sort of abstract or mathematical concepts, which are basically defined by these features. So let's say we have a square. It's two-dimensional. There's four sides, and all sides have the same length, right? So it's equal-sided or equal length of sides. So there's just three features basically that you need there to define a square. Maybe that works for sort of more natural categories as well. So there's a term which is not used as much as it used to in the English language, although there is a TV series keeping this alive. So The Bachelor talks about the exploits of various different bachelors. What's a bachelor? It's a human thing, it's a male thing, it's adult, and it's unmarried, right? Before I gave this lecture today, I didn't have adult in here, but I figured that was appropriate because normally you don't think of little boys as bachelors because they're not really eligible to be married, which is usually sort of the most salient feature of these four for this particular being. So it's an unmarried adult male. You can think about it that these predicate sets form a word's semantic features. Like I said, these are kind of analogous to a phoneme's distinctive features in phonology. And like I said, these features can be applied across different words and ideally across different languages. So we can talk about like a hen and a mare. So a hen is a female chicken, a mare is a female horse. They both share the feature female. A bachelor and a woman, generally speaking, don't have much in common, but they do have the feature human in common, right? And a woman is also a female human, so on and so forth. So that kind of goes across species there as well. Okay, so the same semantic feature or sort of approach to boiling down the meaning of words into features can be found in verbs as well. They're just going to look a little bit different. So for instance, there's a feature go, which I'm putting in brackets here because I don't mean the specific verb go, but rather the semantic idea of going. that reflects a change in position of one thing from one place to another. And we see this feature in a variety of different verbs like fly, walk, roll, stumble, run, and crawl. Like all these are verbs of motion, right? So something's going from somewhere to somewhere else. There are more subtle examples, though, than this that you might not think about. So you can say John gave Mary an engagement ring, and there's actually something going through a motion there, which is the ring. It's going through a change of possession as well. But there's a ring going from John to Mary. In an analogous case, you can think about the boy threw the ball over the fence. The ball is going through the motion here as well. So there's a feature of go for the verb through here, and also the feature go in the word give, or the verb give. This actually helps us explain an interesting feature about verbs like give, these ditransitive verbs, an interesting syntactic feature of what they can do. So just to give you a bit of syntax review here, remember that in syntax there are different verbs that require specific complement structures. So when I'm talking about a transitive verb, that's a verb that requires an object NP in its verb phrase. So you can't just say I devoured. You have to say I devoured the sandwich or some form of food, or you can't just say I met. You have to say I met the professor. I was reading something the other day and encountered the verb exacerbate, but I think exacerbate's a very good example of a transitive verb as well. So you exacerbate a problem. You can't just exacerbate, right? Ditransitive verbs, on the other hand, have to take two different objects in their verb phrases. So the dog trainer sold me a chew toy. Larry gave Shelley the textbook. There's what's called both a direct object here, which in this case is the textbook, and an indirect object, which is Shelley, which is kind of like the recipient of the direct object for a ditransitive verb. So going back to the feature go, the semantic feature go for different verbs, there are subfeatures of go, kind of like we saw like with coronal sounds coronal phonemes in phonology. There are some features of coronal, like strident, right? Only coronal things can be strident. For the feature go, there are subfeatures for that as well. And we see this in constraints on different verb complements in English. So there's a ballistic feature, which is like a one-time go. And there's also a sustained go, which expresses itself differently syntactically. So if you have a ballistic go, you can just make one motion. Sustained go is something you can keep doing over time. And if you have a ballistic go, then you can get two noun phrases as the object of that particular verb that has that feature. But you can't get two noun phrases as the objects of a verb which is a sustained or continuous go. So I'll give you some examples. You can say you can throw the boy a ball. You can't push the boy a ball, even though it seems like it's making the same sort of motion there. You can toss the boy a ball. You can't pull the boy a ball. You can kick the boy a ball. You can't lift the boy a ball. Fling the boy a ball is okay. Drag the boy a ball is not okay. All these should sound pretty bad to you. All these should sound okay, even if you don't say them that often. But these are ballistic verbs. They happen once. Sustained verbs happen continuously over time. Okay, so there's not only some validity to this sort of featural analysis of semantics, but it helps us explain things that we wouldn't be able to explain otherwise. I'm also going to give you another construct that's used in semantic analysis, which is that of thematic roles, which helps us explain how we can get sort of the same meaning out of different syntactic expressions in language. So, like I said, we have these ditransitive verbs. And we've seen before that they can be expressed in two different syntactic ways. So you can say Larry gave Shelley the textbook. What's the complement structure of the VP here? It's a noun phrase and a noun phrase. Larry, you can also say this in a different way, same meaning, but Larry gave the textbook to Shelley. Here we have a noun phrase for the textbook, but Shelley appears as a prepositional phrase here instead. So it's to Shelley. And the syntax changes a little bit too because we're switching the order of these two complements. So despite the syntactic differences, the same meaning, that's exact same meaning basically for these two sentences. And we can describe the roles that each noun phrase is playing in these sentences using a specific set of technical terms about what roles are possible in a sentence for a noun phrase. So Larry, in this case, is what's called an agent, or he is what's called an agent. So that is the entity or being performing the action. He's making it happen. The textbook is what's called the theme. So that's the thing that's being acted upon. I called it the direct object before. I can think of that as a syntactic phrase, but Larry is giving a textbook. He's doing something to the textbook. And then Shelley is the recipient. She's the being who's coming into possession of something, namely the textbook in this case. So there's 3 different roles here, and each of the 3 different noun phrases for subject, direct object, indirect object is fulfilling one of those roles, kind of required by the action of giving. Okay, so verbs have semantic requirements, it turns out, in addition to some syntactic requirements. Not only do some verbs require to have some sort of complement, but verbs can only usually make sense if their semantic requirements are fulfilled by the nouns that are trying to fill these thematic roles for that verb in a sentence. So for a sentence to make sense, it has to have nouns which can play the roles required by the verb. I'll walk you through the different ways of expressing this sentence. So you can say Larry gave Shelley the textbook. Larry gave the textbook to Shelley. I've got color coding here for the agent, theme, and recipient. You can turn this into the passive voice. We didn't look at that much in syntax, but in passive voice sentences, the object of the sentence is the subject, or sorry, the what is normally the object, or in this case, the recipient, turns into the subject of the sentence. So Shelley was given the textbook by Larry, and the agent here is in a prepositional phrase embedded lower down in the sentence. Still playing the role of the agent, though. What you can't get, or what doesn't make a whole lot of sense to try to say in English, is when you substitute sort of a non-conscious or non-intentional being as the noun phrase that's trying to fill the role of agent in this sentence. So you can say, it's okay syntactically to say that anger gave Shelley the textbook, but if you said that, that would be pretty odd. You might find that in a poem somewhere, but most people would look upon you strangely if you tried to say that anger gave Shelley the textbook. And in fact, if some of you did actually say this, you'd probably interpret anger as like a strange first name for somebody who's giving textbooks to people for free for some reason. Even though their name is anger. Okay, so other thematic roles for noun phrases and sentences are an experiencer. So this is a being that has a perceptual or mental experience. So Susan heard the music. All she's doing there is hearing the music. She's not making something happen like an agent would. So she's an experiencer. The source is the origin of a change. So Jan arrived from Detroit. That's where she came from. Detroit is the source. Instrument is the means used to accomplish an action. I've got an example here. The hammer cracked the window. Normally you see instruments in phrases with like with, so it might be easier for me to say like I cracked the window with a hammer. In that case, hammer is still the instrument. If I'm kind of de-emphasizing my role in the cracking of the window, I might say the hammer cracked the window, even though I was the one wielding it, right? So this is the means used to accomplish an action, but not the person who does it. There's also a goal, which is the endpoint of a change in location or possession. So Chris hitchhiked to Alaska. That's where he was going. And then there's a location, which is slightly different. That's a place where an action occurs. So Neil Young played a show in Winnipeg. He's not going to Winnipeg. He's already there. That's just a location in terms of how it plays a role in the sentence. Okay, so there's going to be a question on the homework which asks you to sort of identify the thematic roles of various noun phrases and sentences. So I can't really pause to ask for questions here, but make sure you understand this before you give that a shot and let me know by email or whatever other means if you don't. I'll give you some more examples here of how these things play out across languages. So there's a sentence you could utter in English. I like the book. Maybe you've uttered this before yourself. I like the textbook. Who knows? Where I is the thematic experiencer in this sentence, even though it's the subject of the sentence. This is sort of like Susan heard the music, right? So you're just having an experience of, I guess, the book pleasing you in this particular case. And in fact, that's kind of how it's expressed more directly in the syntax of other languages. So in German, you would say, das Buch gefällt mir, which means the book pleases me, or maybe a little more literally, it would say the book is pleasing to me because it's using kind of the to me phrase here. French, le livre me plaît. These all mean basically the same thing. In Spanish, me gusta el libro. In every single one of these, though, what's kind of interesting is that the person or the noun phrase experiencing the liking of the book is a syntactic object of the sentence. In English, it's a subject. In other languages, it's the object. So the syntax can vary for these things across languages, and it can be switched around even to some extent within a language, but the thematic role stays the same. So, like I said before, particular verbs can have thematic restrictions or restrictions on what kind of noun phrases can fulfill the roles they demand are played in the sort of expression of what's going on. So, for instance, sleep, whatever noun phrase is experiencing sleep has to be animate, and this kind of helps explain why this weird phrase, colorless green ideas sleep furiously, doesn't really work semantically, even though it's okay syntactically. So ideas can't sleep because ideas are not living things as we normally think about them, right? Like animals or humans. The object of frighten has to have a mind, some sort of, ability to be frightened. So you can say sincerity may frighten the boy. And maybe it does. The boy may frighten sincerity is a bit odd, right? Because sincerity doesn't care about the boy in any way, shape, or form. So this one doesn't work semantically for that reason, even though, again, it's okay syntactically. Elapsed, the only thing that can really elapse in the English-speaking world is time. So you can't say something like John elapsed, even though maybe you can think about what that would mean. I don't know. It is snowing. The only thing that can snow in English is it, whatever it is. So you can't say the dog is snowing, although that may conjure up some sort of terrifying imagery in your head if you try to make it make sense. So don't go there. Just assume it doesn't work semantically. Okay. Another verb feature, which is kind of underlying in the structure of the verb, is cause. And so sometimes you'll hear, if you're studying foreign language, people talking about causative verbs. We can see that in an expression like the water boiled versus Laura boiled the water. So normally if you're boiling water, you put it in like a tea kettle or put it on the stove or something like that, right? So Laura's, might be the agent of like putting a pot on the stove. She could do that, but boiling the water is something that happens basically causatively. So the heat of the stove causes the water to boil. The door opened versus the wind opened the door. The window broke versus Larry broke the window. When these verbs are transitive, they have this semantic structure. So like Laura caused the water to boil. She is not the heat itself that is boiling the water, but she can make it happen, right? She can put the water in a context where there's enough heat to make it boil. So in English, this is kind of under the surface, and it's not super easy to see. We don't often express sentences like this with this explicit cause in them. In other languages, that cause feature, though, is explicitly realized on the surface in the morphology. So there's a language called Songhai, which is spoken in Burkina Faso. And I think it's been influenced a bit by French here. So it's got fenêtre de bas. So window, the broke, is syntactically what's going on there. But you can translate that as the window broke. But if somebody breaks the window, like Ali breaks the window, Ali bandi fenêtre di. So Ali broke, and then there's this morpheme in D here, which we didn't see before. With the verb broke, that's the causative morpheme that attaches to that verb to say that Ali broke the window is how we'd say it in English, but you'd translate it a little more literally as Ali caused the window to break from Songhai. Okay, so those are causatives. I can give you a variety of other language differences. So one that's kind of fun that we see in English is that there's different kinds of nouns, and they work differently syntactically, and they kind of fit into different phrases. So these are called count and mass nouns. So count nouns are anything that you can enumerate or count, basically, right? You can pluralize them without any difficulty. So potato is a count noun: 1 potato, 2 potatoes, 3 potatoes, 4, so on and so forth. You can have many potatoes, but you can't have much potato. And chair is a noun that works in a similar fashion. So you can have 3 chairs or many chairs, but you can't have much chair. Mass nouns, on the other hand, cannot be enumerated or pluralized. So you can't have 2 rices or many rice, but you can have much rice. And even though chairs and furniture are basically, or chairs is like a hyponym of furniture, right? Furniture is a mass noun rather than a count noun. So you can't have 3 furnitures or many furniture, but you can have much furniture. Yeah, I was just thinking I probably should have borrowed the clip for this since we saw Steve Carell in the previous, or 2 slides ago, 2 lectures ago, talking about him declaring bankruptcy in the show The Office. There's in the in the movie Anchorman, he also plays a character who's kind of dim-witted, and at some point I think says, "I like lamp." Lamp is a count noun, so it has to have some sort of determiner before that. So like, I like the lamp, or I like lamps. You can pluralize it, it works okay. But you can't just say I like lamp in English, but you can say I like furniture. That's no problem. I like rice, but you can't say I like potato or I like chair. That's another mass noun, count noun difference. And maybe I'll dig up that video for you before the next lecture. Another sort of mass noun, count noun distinction, which is interesting because these are kind of synonymous themselves. So shoes are a count noun, footwear is a mass noun, or coins is a count noun, and change is a mass noun. Again, these mean basically the same thing. Not that people use coins and change that much anymore, but still, you can still think about them syntactically. Italian is a language which divvies up the noun spectrum a little bit differently. So some mass nouns in English are actually count nouns in Italian. For instance, spaghetti, famous borrowing from Italian culture, is a count noun in Italian, even though it's a mass noun in English. So Ivano ha mangiato molti spaghetti ieri sera. I can't speak Italian, so why am I trying? But that means Ivano ate many spaghettis last night. So this is actually a plural noun, which is why the E is at the end here. It's not just a mass noun like we use it in English. Ivano ate a lot of spaghetti last evening. Or Piero ha comprato un mobile. Piero bought a furniture. Again, something you can't really say in English. Or Luisella combed her hairs rather than her hair. So these are all count nouns in Italian. There's also a concept of collective nouns, and this one's interesting to me, and I'm just kind of mentioning it as we go because the English world is changing a little bit from my perspective. So back when I was young, and I might have been talking about the Minnesota Vikings, and I would say that the Minnesota Vikings are winning the game. Or maybe if I was just talking about the team collectively, I would say Minnesota is winning the game. And this is kind of funny because when I put their nickname in here and point out explicitly that this is a plural noun, then it sounds better to say the Minnesota Vikings are winning the game. But if I just talk about the team as one syntactic thing, like Minnesota, then I'd use the singular verb here. Minnesota is winning the game. So what's interesting is that in British English, the tradition is even when you're talking about the team as a singular noun, like Manchester United, you use the plural form of the verb because there's more than one player on the team, basically. So Manchester United are winning the game, which to my ears still sounds odd, but this is an expression or a form of the expression you're hearing more and more in North American English, even say for something like American football, like Minnesota are winning the game. There's also the funny case of Windows, like the operating system for a computer. So Windows is clearly a plural noun here. Windows, there's more than one, but it's just one thing when it's running on your computer, right? So Windows, the operating system, is shutting down. So you can use sort of the singular verb here, even though it's kind of a bit of a mismatch. This leads me to Women, Fire, and Dangerous Things. This is a famous book about linguistics written by the linguist George Lakoff. Where does this come from? So there is this language Dirble. We saw it a couple of lectures ago. It's an Australian language, and it has 4 types of nouns. So it has a system of noun classes is what it's called. Sort of like mass nouns and count nouns, but it's more elaborate in Dirble than it is in English. So in Dirble, each noun must be preceded by a word marker. So I'll give you how the world breaks down in Dirble. So Bayi is the noun marker for one class of nouns, and this refers to human males or animals. The second class of nouns is Balan. This is human females, water, fire, or dangerous things. So women, fire, and dangerous things basically make a whole category of things in the world in this language. Number 3 is balam, which is non-flesh food, which is basically vegetables and fruit, anything that's not meat. And then lastly, it's bala, which is everything else. So if you don't fit into one of these 3 categories, you just go into the collection bin at the end there. But everything in durable, every noun has to have a marker like this. And if you go back to those durable sentences I gave you a while back, you'll see that this class system is working in the example sentences in those slides. And this applies to new items too. So before these durable speakers had contact with the outside world, they didn't have either matches or cigarettes, but then these concepts were introduced into the language, and they had to figure out which noun class they had to go into. So matches became a member of category 2, and cigarettes became a member of category 3, which I guess just goes to show you that a woman is more like a match than a cigarette. And I think that's where I'm going to stop for today. I'm going to talk a little bit more about other language differences in the next lecture, and then that's going to kind of lead into language preservation and language death, which is sort of the goal of trying to preserve as many of these differences as we can for as long as we can to figure out exactly how language works. So I'll say more about that next time. See you then.